Alexander Cole was a billionaire who measured life in profits and power. A man so consumed by ambition, he'd destroyed his own family and hadn't spoken to his son in 12 years. But when his housekeeper collapsed and her 10-year-old daughter Lila stayed under his care, everything changed. In a rare moment of generosity, he offered the girl 3 wishes for anything money could buy, expecting her to ask for toys or luxuries like everyone else. But when Lila spoke her first wish, it wasn't about material things at all. She asked for something Alexander had buried deep in his heart, something so painful he could barely breathe when she said it. And suddenly, this little girl held the power to either save or completely destroy him. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The Cole mansion stood like a fortress at the edge of the city, its limestone walls and towering windows reflecting the afternoon sun. Inside, silence reigned, the kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from loneliness. Alexander Cole moved through the hallways with measured steps, his silver hair perfectly combed, his tailored suit crisp despite the hour. At 63, he carried himself like a man who had conquered the world but found the victory hollow. He paused at the entrance to his library, a room lined floor to ceiling with books he never read anymore. There, curled up in the leather chair by the window, sat Lila Williams. The 10-year-old had her nose buried in a worn copy of fairy tales, her dark braids falling over her shoulders as she traced the illustrations with one finger. "Shouldn't you be with your mother?" Alexander's voice cut through the quiet, not harsh, but firm. Lila looked up, her brown eyes bright and unafraid. "Mama's cleaning the east wing. She said I could read here if I stay quiet." He grunted in response, moving to his desk. Most children feared him. His staff certainly did. Even grown men in boardrooms shifted nervously when he entered. But this child, the daughter of his housekeeper Ruth, seemed immune to his reputation. She'd been coming to the mansion after school for the past year, ever since Ruth's childcare arrangements fell through. Alexander had allowed it with reluctance, expecting the girl to be a nuisance. Instead, she was unnervingly perceptive. "Mr. Cole?" Lila's voice interrupted his thoughts. "What?" "Why do you have so many books if you don't read them?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "I read them. Years ago. But not now? Now I have more important things to do." Lila tilted her head, studying him with that unnerving intensity children sometimes possess. "Mama says reading keeps your heart soft. Maybe that's why you're always frowning." Before Alexander could respond with the sharp rebuke forming on his tongue, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Ruth Williams appeared in the doorway, her dark skin glistening with perspiration, her uniform neat despite hours of work. She was a woman in her early 40s, dignified and hard-working, who never complained about the endless tasks Alexander's enormous house demanded. "Lila, baby, come on now. Stop bothering Mr. Cole." "She's not bothering me," Alexander said, surprising himself. "She's reading." Ruth smiled gratefully, but Alexander noticed how she steadied herself against the doorframe. "I'm just about finished with the upstairs. I'll start dinner in—" Her words cut off abruptly. Ruth's eyes rolled back and she crumpled to the floor. "Mama!" Lila's scream pierced the air. Alexander moved faster than he had in years. He dropped to his knees beside Ruth, checking her pulse with hands that suddenly remembered an old first aid course. Her heartbeat was there, but weak, her breathing shallow. "Call an ambulance," he barked at Lila, but she was already frozen in shock, tears streaming down her face. Alexander pulled out his own phone, dialing emergency services while loosening Ruth's collar. "This is Alexander Cole at 1840 Riverside Estate. My employee has collapsed. Send an ambulance immediately and make it fast." The operator tried to keep him on the line, but Alexander was already lifting Ruth in his arms, carrying her toward the front entrance. For a man his age, He moved with surprising strength, driven by something he hadn't felt in years: genuine concern for another person's well-being. Leela ran behind him, sobbing, stumbling over her own feet. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Alexander's name still carried weight in this city. As paramedics loaded Ruth onto a stretcher, she regained consciousness briefly, her hand reaching for her daughter. "Lila, my baby." "I'm here, Mama. I'm right here." "I'm accompanying them to the hospital," Alexander announced to the startled paramedics. "The child comes with me." No one dared argue with him. At the hospital, doctors rushed Ruth into examination, while Alexander stood in the waiting room with Lila pressed against his side. The girl had stopped crying but trembled like a leaf. Without thinking, Alexander placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture he hadn't made in over a decade. "Your mother will be fine," he said, his voice softer than usual. "She's strong. She works too hard," Lila whispered. "She never stops. Even when she's tired, she keeps going because we need the money." The words struck Alexander like a physical blow. He employed Ruth, paid her well by industry standards, but had never once considered the weight she carried. The long hours, the physical toll, the worry of raising a daughter alone. It had all been invisible to him. A doctor emerged 2 hours later. "Ms. Williams is stable. She's severely exhausted and dehydrated. Her blood pressure is dangerously low. She needs complete rest for at least a week, possibly 2. "She'll have it," Alexander said firmly. "I'll arrange everything." That night, he brought Lila back to the mansion. The child was silent during the ride, staring out the window at the darkening sky. When they arrived, she stood in the grand foyer looking small and lost. "You'll stay here until your mother recovers," Alexander announced. "The guest room upstairs has been prepared. I don't want to be a bother." "You're not." But as the days passed, Lila's presence did bother him. Not because she was difficult, but because she disrupted the careful, emotional walls he'd built. She asked questions constantly, observed everything, and somehow saw through his carefully maintained facade. On the third evening, Alexander found himself sitting across from Lila at the dining table, something he never did. Usually, he ate in his study while working, but Mrs. Patterson, the cook, had insisted on serving a proper meal, and Lila had asked if he'd join her. "Mama's doing better," Lila said, picking at her roasted chicken. "I called her today. She says the nurses are nice." "Good." Silence stretched between them. Alexander hadn't shared a meal with anyone in years, and he'd forgotten how to make conversation that wasn't about quarterly reports or stock prices. "Can I ask you something?" Lila's voice was quiet but clear. "You're going to, anyway. If you had all the money in the world, what would you do with it?" Alexander raised an eyebrow. "I do have all the money in the world. I buy what I need." "But what would you buy if you could buy anything? Like anything at all?" He considered the question, then said honestly, "There's nothing left I want. Money buys things, not happiness. That's sad. That's reality." Lila set down her fork, her expression thoughtful. "If I were rich, I'd fix things people broke but never apologized for. Like I'd help people say sorry when they're too scared to." Alexander stared at her, caught off guard by the answer's depth. That's an unusual wish for a child. "Mama says the world has too many broken things and not enough people willing to mend them." Something shifted in Alexander's chest, a crack in the ice. This little girl spoke with wisdom beyond her years, and it unsettled him. He found himself genuinely curious about her thoughts, something that hadn't happened with another person in longer than he could remember. "Tell you what," he said impulsively. "I'll grant you 3 wishes. Anything you want. Name it and I'll buy it for you." Lila's eyes widened. "Anything?" "Within reason. No ponies in the living room." She smiled, a beautiful, genuine smile that lit up her whole face. Then her expression grew serious. She put down her napkin, folded her hands on the table, and looked directly into Alexander's eyes with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Then my first wish," she said softly, "is for you to forgive your son." The words hit Alexander like a physical assault. The room seemed to tilt. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white as a roaring filled his ears. That name, son, hadn't been spoken in this house in 12 years. It was forbidden territory, locked away in the darkest corner of his heart. "How do you—" His voice came out strangled. "Who told you about—" "Nobody told me," Lila said, her voice steady despite the fear flickering in her eyes at his reaction. "But I see things, and I know you're sad about something bigger than money." Alexander stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His breath came in short gasps. Anger, grief, and shock warred inside him, emotions he'd spent years suppressing now threatening to explode. "You don't know what you're talking about," he managed. "You're a child. You don't understand." "I understand that you're lonely," Lila interrupted, "and that whatever happened with your son still hurts. Mama says pain doesn't go away when you ignore it. It just gets heavier." Alexander turned away from her, his entire body trembling. How could this child, this 10-year-old girl, see through him so completely? How did she even know he had a son? He'd been so careful, so controlled, keeping that part of his life sealed away. "This conversation is over," he said, his voice cold. "Go to your room." Lila stood slowly, gathering her plate. At the doorway, she paused. "I'm sorry if I made you angry, Mr. Cole, but that's still my first wish. Whenever you're ready." She left him standing alone in the dining room, and for the first time in over a decade, Alexander Cole felt tears burning behind his eyes. Alexander didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched on the desk before him, staring at nothing. Lila's words echoed in his mind, refusing to be silenced. By the time dawn broke over the horizon, he'd made a decision. He stormed down to the security office in the basement, startling the night guard who was preparing to end his shift. "Pull up the exterior camera footage," Alexander demanded. "All gates and perimeter cameras. Past 6 months. The guard blinked in confusion. "Sir, is there a security concern?" "Just do it." It took an hour to review the recordings, but Alexander found what Lila had described. There, on multiple occasions over the past months, a young man appeared at the front gate during late evening hours. He never pressed the intercom, never tried to enter. He simply stood there, hands in his pockets, staring at the mansion for 10, sometimes 15 minutes before walking away. Alexander's heart hammered as he zoomed in on the figure's face. Even through the grainy security footage, the features were unmistakable. Evan, his son. 28 years old now, no longer the angry teenager who'd stormed out of this house at 16. The billionaire's hands shook as he clicked through the timestamps. January 15th, February 3rd, March 22nd, April 9th. The visits were irregular but consistent. Evan had been coming here, standing at the gate like a ghost, and then leaving without a word. "Why?" Alexander whispered to the empty room. "Why come but never knock?" "Because he's as stubborn as you are," a voice in his head answered. "Because he's waiting for you to make the first move." Alexander deleted the footage from the main server, a habit from years of controlling information, and returned to his study. As the morning sun filled the room, memories he'd tried to bury came flooding back. Evan had been 17 when the final break happened, a bright, compassionate boy who wanted to study social work instead of business. Alexander had been furious. He'd built an empire, created opportunities, and his only son wanted to throw it all away to help troubled kids. The arguments had been vicious. Alexander said things he regretted, that Evan was wasting his potential, that compassion was weakness, that the real world would crush his naive idealism. Evan fought back with equal ferocity, calling his father heartless, cold, obsessed with money over family. The night Evan left, he'd stood in this very study and said, "I don't want your money or your name. I don't want to become like you, someone who has everything but feels nothing." Alexander had let him go. Pride wouldn't allow him to chase after a boy who rejected everything he'd built. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months, months to years. By the time Alexander considered reaching out, the silence between them had become an impenetrable wall. A knock on the study door interrupted his thoughts. Lila entered, already dressed for the day, her backpack slung over one shoulder. "I'm going to visit Mama at the hospital," she announced. "Mrs. Patterson said she'd drive me." Alexander nodded curtly. "Fine." Lila hesitated at the door. "Did you think about my wish?" "That's none of your concern." "But it is. I used my wish for it. Then you wasted it." Alexander snapped. "Some things can't be fixed, Lila. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt." The girl's expression softened with something that looked like pity. "Mama says the hardest bridges to build are the ones worth crossing." After she left, Alexander tried to lose himself in work. He had an important merger to finalize. His company was acquiring a smaller tech firm, and the paperwork required his attention. But concentration eluded him. Every document blurred into memories of Evan as a child, sitting in this same office, asking questions about business with genuine curiosity. When had it gone wrong? When had ambition replaced love? The day dragged on. Alexander attended a video conference, but his mind wandered. His CFO, Grant Avery, noticed his distraction and asked if everything was all right. Alexander waved him off curtly, annoyed at his own weakness showing. By evening, his temper had frayed completely. During a meeting with his executive team, one of his vice presidents, a competent man named Robert Fisher, made a minor miscalculation in a financial projection. It was a small error, easily corrected, but Alexander exploded. "This is unacceptable," he roared, slamming his hand on the Heste conference table. "I don't pay you to be incompetent. If you can't handle basic mathematics, perhaps you should find employment elsewhere." The room fell silent. Robert's face flushed with humiliation. "Sir, I apologize." "Your apology means nothing. You're fired. Clear out your office tonight." Robert stood slowly, his jaw tight. "Understood, Mr. Cole. But for the record, I've given 15 years to this company. One mistake shouldn't—" "Get out." Robert left. The remaining executives avoided Alexander's gaze. The meeting concluded quickly, everyone eager to escape his presence. What Alexander didn't know was that Robert, angry and humiliated, went straight to his social media accounts. Within an hour, the story spread. A viral post about toxic billionaire bosses who destroyed careers over minor errors. Alexander's name trended online, not for his business acumen, but for his cruelty. That night, Lila returned from the hospital to find Alexander in the library, staring at nothing. She approached quietly, carrying something in her hands. "I made this for you at the hospital," she said, placing a piece of paper on his lap. Alexander looked down. It was a child's drawing, done in colored pencils. 3 figures stood on a bridge, a tall man with silver hair, a younger man, and between them, connecting their hands, a small bridge. Above them, she'd written in careful letters, "Family isn't broken, it's just waiting to be fixed." "Wish number 2? Alexander asked, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't suppress. Lila shook her head. "Not yet. You haven't finished the first one." "I can't finish it. You don't understand." "I understand that he comes here," she interrupted gently. "I've seen him. 3 times. He stands at the gate and looks at the house like he's trying to find courage to knock. And you sitting here like you're trying to find courage to open the door. But nobody moves." Alexander's breath caught. You've seen him? Last month, I was sitting by the garden wall doing homework. I saw him through the fence. He looked sad. Like you look sad. The billionaire closed his eyes, overwhelmed. This child had witnessed what he'd been too blind to see. His son had been reaching out in the only way he could, silent, tentative, afraid of rejection. What did he look like? Alexander asked, his voice barely a whisper. Tall, brown hair. He has your eyes, sad and kind at the same time, even when they're trying to be tough. Alexander stood abruptly, the drawing falling from his lap. He walked to the window overlooking the front gate, the same gate where Evan had stood. In the distance, city lights twinkled. Somewhere out there, his son lived a life Alexander knew nothing about. He pulled out his phone. Evan's number was still saved. Alexander had never had the courage to delete it. His finger hovered over the call button. What would he say? How could he possibly begin to undo 12 years of silence? Before he could decide, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. Grant Avery's name flashed on the screen. What? Alexander answered curtly. Sir, we have a problem. The Robert Fisher situation has escalated. His social media post has gone viral. 20,000 shares and counting. Multiple news outlets are picking up the story. This is becoming a PR nightmare. Alexander's jaw clenched. Of course, in today's world, a single moment of cruelty could destroy a reputation built over decades. Handle it, he said. It's not that simple. The board is concerned. They're calling an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. After hanging up, Alexander turned to find Lila still standing there, watching him with those two knowing eyes. You're angry again, she observed. I'm always angry. Maybe that's the real problem. Maybe that's why your son left. The words cut deep because they were true. Alexander had spent years channeling every emotion into anger. It was safer than grief, easier than vulnerability. Go to bed, Lila. Will you think about calling him? I said go to bed. She left reluctantly. Alexander returned to the window, Evan's number still glowing on his phone screen. His finger trembled over the call button, but fear, cold, paralyzing fear, stopped him. What if Evan rejected him? What if 12 years had created a chasm too wide to cross? What if his son hated him? Alexander set down the phone, the call unmade. Outside, the city continued its restless existence, unaware of the silent battle raging in the heart of a man who'd conquered everything except his own demons. In her room upstairs, Lila Williams said a quiet prayer for the broken family she'd decided to help mend. The first wish remained unfulfilled, hanging in the air like an unfinished promise, but seeds had been planted, seeds that would soon grow into something neither Alexander nor Evan could ignore. Morning would bring new challenges, but tonight, for the first time in 12 years, Alexander Cole allowed himself to remember what it felt like to be a father. And in that remembering, something long dormant began, ever so slowly, to awaken. The morning after Alexander discovered the surveillance footage and failed to call his son, the billionaire found himself facing a different kind of crisis. The emergency board meeting had been moved up, and the viral scandal surrounding Robert Fisher's firing continued to spread like wildfire across every social media platform. Alexander stood before the bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie with hands that trembled slightly. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. He hadn't slept more than 2 hours. Every time he'd closed his eyes, he saw Evan's face in that grainy security footage, standing alone at the gate. Downstairs, Lila sat at the breakfast table, quietly eating cereal while reading a library book. She looked up when Alexander entered, her expression cautious. "Did you call him?" she asked softly. "No." "Why not?" "Because some conversations can't happen over the phone." The words came out harsher than he intended. I have to go to the office. Mrs. Patterson will drive you to school. Can I visit Mama after school? Yes, I'll have someone take you. Alexander grabbed his briefcase and headed for the door, but Lila's voice stopped him. Mr. Cole, the longer you wait, the harder it gets. Like a Band-Aid, you have to rip it off fast or it just hurts more. He didn't respond, but her words followed him all the way to the office. The board meeting was exactly as brutal as Alexander had anticipated. Shareholders were angry, demanding explanations for the negative publicity. His decades of success suddenly meant nothing compared to one viral moment of cruelty. Grant Avery tried to defend him, but even his CFO's loyalty couldn't stem the tide of criticism. This is unacceptable behavior from a CEO, board member Patricia Holloway declared, her voice sharp. We're hemorrhaging stock value by the hour. Investors are pulling out. You've made us look like heartless corporate monsters. One incident doesn't define 30 years of leadership, Alexander shot back, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. It does when it confirms what people already suspect about you. Another board member added, that you're cold, ruthless, and don't value your employees. The meeting ended with a warning. Improve the company's public image within 2 weeks or face a vote of no confidence. Alexander left the boardroom feeling something he hadn't experienced in decades, genuine fear about losing control. He returned to his office and closed the door, leaning against it as exhaustion washed over him. The empire he'd spent his entire adult life building was crumbling, and for what? Pride? Anger? The inability to control his worst impulses? His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I heard about the board meeting. I'm sorry you're going through this. E. Alexander stared at the message, his heart pounding. Evan. His son had somehow heard about the meeting and reached out. After 12 years of silence, this simple text felt like a miracle and a torment all at once. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. What could he possibly say? Thank you. I miss you. I'm sorry for everything. Before he could type anything, his office door burst open. His secretary, Maria, looked panicked. Mr. Cole, there are protesters outside. About 20 people with signs demanding you rehire Mr. Fisher and apologize. Alexander moved to the window. Below, a small crowd had gathered, their signs visible even from the 15th floor. Billionaires aren't above decency, and fire the CEO, not good workers. Call security, he said wearily. Already done, sir. But this is spreading online, too. Someone's live streaming it. Alexander turned away from the window, feeling the walls closing in. Everything was falling apart, and he had no idea how to stop it. Meanwhile, across the city, Evan Cole sat in his small office at the youth center where he worked. The space was cluttered with donated books, art supplies, and second-hand furniture, a far cry from his father's pristine corporate environment. He stared at his phone, wondering if his text had been a mistake. 12 years. 12 years of building a life separate from his father's shadow, and one news article had pulled him right back in. When he'd seen the viral post about Alexander firing an employee, Evan's first reaction had been familiar disappointment. There goes Dad, being Dad. But then he'd read deeper into the story, noticed the comments about Alexander seeming distracted and unstable lately, and concern had overridden his resentment. Whatever their history, this was still his father. The man who'd taught him to ride a bike, who'd read him bedtime stories before ambition consumed everything else. Hey, Evan, you got a minute? Evan looked up to see Marcus, one of his teenage volunteers, standing in the doorway. The 17-year-old had been through the foster system and was now trying to stay on track while living in a group home. Of course. What's up? Marcus shuffled in, holding a piece of paper. I wrote something for the college application essay. Wanted to know if it's any good. Evan took the paper and read. It was raw, honest writing about overcoming abandonment and finding purpose through helping younger kids. Pride swelled in his chest. "Marcus, this is excellent, really powerful stuff." "Yeah?" The teen's face lit up. "You think colleges will like it? I think they'll love it. You're going to do great things." After Marcus left, Evan sat back in his chair thinking about the different paths he and his father had taken. Alexander measured success in quarterly earnings and stock prices. Evan measured it in moments like these, watching broken kids find their strength. He picked up his phone again, scrolling through news articles about his father's scandal. The comments were vicious, calling Alexander a heartless tyrant, a symbol of everything wrong with corporate America. Some of the criticism was deserved, but Evan remembered the man beneath the reputation. The father who'd cried at his mother's funeral, who'd once been capable of love before grief hardened him. That afternoon, as Evan was locking up the youth center, a small voice called out to him from across the street. "Mr. Cole?" He turned to see a young black girl with braids, maybe 9 or 10 years old, standing nervously on the sidewalk. She wore a school uniform and clutched a backpack. "Can I help you?" Evan asked, crossing the street. "Are you Alexander Cole's son?" Evan's guard went up immediately. "Who's asking?" "My name's Lila Williams. My mama works for your father. I mean, she did. She's in the hospital right now, so we're staying at the mansion." Evan's confusion deepened. "How did you find me?" "I looked up the youth center online. The website has your picture. I took the bus here after school." She said it so matter-of-factly, as if tracking down strangers was a normal 10-year-old activity. "Does your mom know you're here?" "She's still at the hospital, and Mr. Cole thinks I'm at school." "Lila, you shouldn't—" "Your father isn't mean," she interrupted, her voice urgent. "Everyone thinks he is, but he's not. He's lonely. He's sad. And he misses you so much it's making him sick." Evan felt like he'd been punched. "What are you talking about?" "I gave him 3 wishes. Well, technically he gave them to me, but I'm using them to fix things. My first wish was for him to forgive you, but I think maybe you need to forgive him too." This child spoke with such earnest conviction that Evan didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "Lila, it's more complicated than—" "Adults always say that," she said, her eyes suddenly bright with tears. "They say things are complicated when really they're just scared. You come to his gate at night. I've seen you. And he sits in his study looking at old photos. You both want the same thing, but nobody's brave enough to try." Evan's throat tightened. "He told you about me?" "No, I figured it out. But when I mentioned you, he got so upset he couldn't even finish dinner. That's how I knew it mattered. Listen, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but you don't understand our history. I understand that life's too short to stay angry at people you love," Lila said firmly. "My daddy died when I was 6. Heart attack. One day he was there, the next he wasn't. Mama says she wishes she'd told him she loved him that morning, but she was rushing and forgot. Now she can't ever tell him." The words hung in the air between them. Evan crouched down to Lila's eye level. "I'm sorry about your dad. I'm sorry about yours too, because he's alive and you could talk to him, but you don't. That's even sadder, I think." Before Evan could respond, his phone rang. An unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Hello? Mr. Cole?" An older woman's voice. "This is Mrs. Patterson, the cook at your father's house. I'm calling about Lila. She was supposed to be home an hour ago, and we can't find her." Evan looked at the girl, who suddenly seemed very small and scared. "She's with me," Evan said. "She's safe. I'll bring her back." The drive to the mansion was quiet at first. Lila sat in the passenger seat of Evan's beat-up Honda, looking out the window at the city passing by. Finally, she spoke. "Are you mad at me?" "No. Worried, maybe. You could have gotten hurt taking the bus alone." "I had to try. You're both so stubborn." Evan couldn't help but smile. You sound like someone who's been around stubborn people a lot. Mama says I inherited it from my daddy. He never gave up on anything. As they approached the mansion, Evan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He hadn't been through these gates in 12 years. The wrought iron barriers that once felt like a prison now looked smaller somehow, less intimidating. You don't have to come in, Lila said quietly, reading his hesitation. You can just drop me at the gate. No, I'll make sure you get inside safely. He pressed the intercom button. A crackle. Then Mrs. Patterson's relieved voice. Oh, thank goodness, come right in. The gates swung open. Evan drove slowly up the long driveway, memories flooding back with each passing tree and sculpture. There was the fountain where he'd caught tadpoles as a kid. There was the oak tree he'd fallen from and broken his arm. There was the rose garden his mother had loved. The front door opened before they reached it. Mrs. Patterson stood there, relief written across her face. But behind her, emerging from the shadows of the foyer, was Alexander. Father and son locked eyes for the first time in 12 years. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken words, unresolved pain, and impossible longing. Evan saw how much his father had aged. The silver hair, the deeper lines around his eyes, the way he held himself like a man carrying unbearable weight. Alexander saw in Evan the boy he'd lost and the man he'd never gotten to know. Taller, broader, with eyes that held compassion instead of the ambition Alexander had tried to force into him. Thank you for bringing her back, Alexander said finally, his voice carefully neutral. She's persuasive, Evan replied, just as carefully. Layla looked between them, frustration evident on her young face. You're both ridiculous, just hug already. Lila, Mrs. Patterson gasped. That's not appropriate. It's exactly appropriate. The girl insisted. They're family. They're supposed to hug. But neither man moved. The gulf between them felt too vast, the hurt too deep. I should go, Evan said, backing toward his car. Wait, Alexander said suddenly. The word came out rough, desperate. The charity event. The one at Westbrook Elementary. Lila mentioned it. She said you volunteer there. Sometimes, with the older kids. She organized something, this Saturday. She wanted me to attend. Lila's eyes went wide. She hadn't actually finalized anything yet, but she nodded enthusiastically. Yes, a fundraiser for the school library. Lots of families coming. It'll be nice. Evan looked at his father, searching for the catch. You're going to a school fundraiser? Apparently. Alexander's voice softened almost imperceptibly. Lila can be very persuasive. I've noticed. Another silence, but this one felt different. Less hostile, more uncertain. Like two people standing on opposite sides of a frozen lake, testing whether the ice would hold. I'll be there, Evan said finally. Saturday, 2 o'clock. I'll see you then. Evan drove away, his hands shaking so badly he had to pull over 2 blocks from the mansion. He gripped the steering wheel and let out a shaky breath. Seeing his father again had ripped open wounds he'd thought were healed, but it had also revealed something unexpected. Beneath the anger and hurt, there was still love. Buried deep, scarred, and battered, but alive. Back at the mansion, Alexander stood at the window watching Evan's taillights disappear. Lila came to stand beside him. That wasn't so hard, was it? She asked. That was the hardest thing I've done in years. But you did it. That's what matters. Alexander looked down at her. This remarkable child who'd somehow seen through all his defenses. Why do you care so much about fixing this? Because you've been kind to me and Mama, and because I know what it's like to miss someone. I miss my daddy every day. But you have a chance to get your family back. That's special. That night, Alexander sat in his study with a glass of whiskey. But for the first time in months, he didn't drink it. Instead, he opened his laptop and searched for information about his son's life. The youth center where Evan worked had a modest website with photos of smiling kids, murals painted on walls, and Evan teaching a group of teenagers to cook. His son looked happy, genuinely, radiantly happy in a way Alexander had never been, despite all his wealth. The realization was both painful and illuminating. His phone buzzed. A text from Evan. "Thank you for agreeing to come Saturday. It means more than you know." Alexander stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Thank you for coming today. I know it wasn't easy." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, "Nothing about this is easy, but maybe it's worth trying." Alexander saved the message, then pulled out the drawing Lila had made, the one with 3 figures on a bridge. He pinned it to the wall beside his desk where he could see it every day. Saturday felt both impossibly far away and terrifyingly close. Saturday arrived with clear skies and nervous energy thrumming through Alexander's veins. He'd barely eaten breakfast, changing his shirt 3 times before finally settling on something casual, a decision that felt monumentally important and utterly ridiculous. Lila watched his anxiety with barely concealed amusement. "You look nice, Mr. Cole." "I look like I'm trying too hard." "You look like someone who cares. That's good." The drive to Westbrook Elementary took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. When they arrived, the parking lot was already filling with families. Colorful banners hung from the building announcing the library fundraiser, and children ran across the playground, their laughter carrying on the spring breeze. Alexander felt profoundly out of place among the minivans and casual Saturday clothing. His town car drew curious stares. "Ready?" Lila asked, taking his hand. He wasn't, but he nodded anyway. Inside the school gymnasium, tables were set up with baked goods, used books, and crafts made by students. Volunteers manned different stations while children played games. It was chaotic, warm, and alive. Everything Alexander's life wasn't. He spotted Evan almost immediately. His son stood near the book table helping a young boy find a book about dinosaurs. When Evan looked up and saw Alexander, his smile faltered for just a moment before returning, more tentative now. They approached each other like wary animals, aware of every eye in the room watching. "You came," Evan said. "I said I would." "You look." Evan paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "You look uncomfortable." "I am." The honesty surprised them both. Evan's expression softened slightly. "Want some terrible coffee? The PTA makes it, and it's universally awful. But it's tradition." "Sure." They walked to the refreshment table together, and Alexander was acutely aware of the distance between them. Close enough to talk, far enough to maintain safety. Lila had disappeared into the crowd of children, leaving them alone. "So," Evan said, handing Alexander a styrofoam cup. "How have you been?" "Terrible, actually. My company's imploding, the board wants my head, and I haven't slept properly in weeks." Evan blinked, clearly not expecting such blunt honesty. "I heard about the Robert Fisher thing. It's all over the news." "It's worse than the news shows. I've spent 30 years building that company, and I might lose it over one moment of stupidity." Was it just stupidity, or was it how you actually feel? The question cut deep. Alexander took a sip of the terrible coffee to buy time. "Both, maybe. I was angry. He made a mistake, and I couldn't control myself. It wasn't about him. It was about—" He stopped, unsure how to continue. "About everything else?" Evan finished quietly. "About carrying too much for too long until one small thing breaks you?" Alexander looked at his son, startled by how well Evan understood. "Yes." They stood in silence, watching the fundraiser bustle around them. Children laughed, parents chatted, volunteers hustled between tables. It was ordinary and beautiful in its ordinariness, a kind of beauty Alexander had forgotten existed. "I saw you," Alexander said suddenly. On the security cameras, coming to the gate. Evan's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. You knew? Not until recently. Lila told me and I checked the footage. You came multiple times. I wanted to, Evan admitted, but I didn't know what to say. 12 years is a long time. Too long. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Alexander's chest felt tight. Emotions he'd suppressed for over a decade, threatening to overwhelm him. Why did you come? He asked. Evan set down his coffee cup, his jaw working as he struggled with his own emotions. Because you're still my father. Because Mom would have wanted me to try. Because I kept thinking, what if something happened and we never? His voice broke. Alexander's vision blurred. He set down his own cup before he dropped it. I'm sorry, he said, the words coming out raw and desperate. For everything. For pushing you away. For choosing pride over love. For being so afraid of losing control that I lost you instead. Evan's eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry, too, for leaving the way I did, for staying away so long, for... Excuse me, Mr. Cole. Both men turned. A hospital administrator stood there, her face grave. Alexander's blood ran cold. It's Ruth Williams. She's taken a turn. They're asking for Lila immediately. The fundraiser forgotten, they rushed to the hospital. Evan driving because Alexander's hands were shaking too badly. Lila sat in the back seat, silent tears streaming down her face. At the hospital, they found Ruth in a private room, monitors beeping steadily around her. She looked smaller in the hospital bed, fragile in a way she'd never appeared while working. But she was conscious. And when she saw Lila, relief flooded her features. Baby girl, come here. Lila rushed to her mother's side, and Ruth held her tight. I'm okay. I'm okay. They just wanted to keep me another few days. My blood pressure spiked, but they've got it under control now. You scared me, Mama. I know. I'm sorry. Alexander stood in the doorway, watching the reunion with Evan beside him. The fear that had gripped him during the drive had been visceral and shocking. When had Ruth become more than just an employee? When had she become someone whose well-being mattered so deeply? Ruth looked up and saw them both. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Alexander and Evan together. Mr. Cole, both of you. She smiled weakly. That's quite a picture. How are you feeling? Alexander asked, stepping into the room. Tired. They said I pushed myself too hard for too long. Imagine that. Her voice held gentle irony. Ruth, I need to say something. Alexander moved closer to the bed, his usual commanding presence softened by genuine concern. When you're released, you're not returning to work. Not as a housekeeper. Ruth's face fell. Sir, please, I need this job. Let me finish. You're not returning as a housekeeper because you won't be working anymore. Not for anyone. I'm setting up a trust fund for you and Lila, enough to live comfortably for the rest of your lives. The room fell silent. Ruth stared at him, disbelief written across her face. I don't understand. You've worked for me for 6 years, Ruth. You've been loyal, dedicated, and you've raised an extraordinary daughter. You've earned rest. Mr. Cole, I can't accept. You can, and you will. He glanced at Lila. Someone recently taught me that wealth means nothing if you don't use it to fix what's broken. You collapsed from exhaustion in my house. That's broken. I'm fixing it. Ruth's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to say. Say you'll take care of yourself. Say you'll let yourself rest for once. Lila suddenly spoke up, her voice clear despite her tears. It's my second wish, Mama. I wished for you to never have to clean again, for anyone. Mr. Cole is making it come true. Ruth looked at her daughter, then at Alexander, then back to Lila. Baby, what did you do? I used my wishes smart, like you taught me. Despite everything, Ruth laughed. a sound of pure joy mixed with disbelief. She reached out and took Alexander's hand. "Thank you. I don't have words big enough for this thank you, but thank you." Alexander squeezed her hand gently. "You're welcome. And I'm sorry for not seeing how hard you were working, for not caring enough about your well-being." "You cared when it mattered," Ruth said softly. "You got me to the hospital. You kept my daughter safe. That's everything." Later that evening, after the doctors assured them Ruth was stable, Alexander, Evan, and Lila sat in the hospital cafeteria, sharing terrible sandwiches and slightly better coffee. The tension between father and son had eased, replaced by something fragile but real, the beginning of reconnection. "2 wishes down," Evan said to Lila. "What's the third?" Lila shook her head. "I'm not telling yet. I'll know when it's the right time." "She's strategic," Evan said to Alexander with a small smile. "Wonder where she learned that." "Not from me," Alexander replied. "I've been terrible at strategy lately." "You made it to the fundraiser. You're here now. That's better strategy than you think." They sat quietly for a moment, and then Alexander's phone rang. Grant Avery's name flashed on the screen. Alexander's expression darkened as he answered. "What is it?" His CFO's voice was urgent. "Sir, we have a serious problem. I found irregularities in some recent accounts, numbers that don't add up. I think someone's been moving money." "What kind of money?" "Millions. I need you to come to the office. Tonight, if possible." Alexander glanced at Evan, then at Lila, who'd fallen asleep against his son's shoulder. For once, work didn't feel like the most important thing. "Tomorrow," he said firmly. "Send me the preliminary findings. But I'm not coming in tonight. I'm with my family." The word hung in the air after he hung up. Family. He'd said it without thinking, including Evan in that definition as naturally as breathing. Evan had heard it too. His eyes were bright with emotion. "Dad, don't," Alexander said quietly. "Not yet. Let's just sit here for a while." So they did. 3 people in a hospital cafeteria, surrounded by the sick and worried, somehow finding in that unlikely place the first real peace any of them had felt in years. Ruth was safe. Lila had her second wish granted, and Alexander Cole, for the first time in over a decade, had called someone family. It wasn't forgiveness yet. It wasn't healing yet. But it was a start. A crack in the ice, a bridge beginning to form where only a chasm had existed before. Outside the hospital windows, night fell over the city. Somewhere in the darkness, trouble was brewing. Financial irregularities that would soon explode into crisis. But in this moment, none of them knew. In this moment, they simply existed together, and that was enough. The next morning would bring new challenges, but tonight belonged to the small victories, to second wishes, granted and broken relationships beginning to mend. The fragile peace of the hospital cafeteria shattered the moment Alexander walked into his office Monday morning. Grant Avery stood waiting, his usually composed face pale and strained. Spread across Alexander's desk were financial documents, spreadsheets filled with highlighted numbers and printouts of offshore account transactions. "It's worse than I thought," Grant said without preamble. "Someone's been siphoning funds for at least 6 months, maybe longer." Alexander sat down heavily, scanning the documents. Millions of dollars had been moved through shell companies, disguised as legitimate business expenses, vendor payments, and consulting fees. The trail was sophisticated, clearly designed by someone who understood the company's financial structure intimately. "Who has access to authorize these transactions?" Alexander asked, his voice cold. "At this level? Only executives, maybe 5 people total, including you and me." "Then we have a traitor." Alexander's hands clenched into fists. After everything, the public scandal, the board's threats, his attempt to reconcile with his son. Now this. Who? I don't know yet. But whoever it is planned this carefully. They've been positioning themselves to make it look like you authorized everything. Alexander's blood ran cold. They're framing me. It's possible. If this goes public before we identify the real culprit, you'll take the fall. The board, the shareholders, the media, they'll crucify you. Before Alexander could respond, his office door burst open. Patricia Holloway strode in, her expression thunderous, followed by 3 other board members. "We need to talk," she announced. "Now." "I'm in the middle of—" "We know about the missing money," Patricia interrupted. "Anonymous documents were sent to every board member this morning. Financial records showing systematic theft from company accounts, all traced back to your authorization codes." Alexander stood slowly. "That's impossible. I didn't authorize. The evidence says otherwise. Millions of dollars, Alexander. Moved to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, all with your digital signature. Someone forged them. Grant just discovered the irregularities. We were about to investigate." "How convenient," another board member sneered. "Your CFO discovers fraud the same day we receive proof that you're the one stealing." Grant stepped forward. "With respect, I've worked with Mr. Cole for 15 years. This doesn't match his character or his methods. Someone is setting him up." "Or you're protecting him," Patricia shot back. "Either way, this board has no choice. Alexander, you're suspended, effective immediately. Pending a full investigation, you're barred from the building and all company operations." The words hit like physical blows. Alexander's empire, built over 3 decades, was being ripped away. "You can't do this. I built this company from nothing." "And apparently, you've been robbing it blind," Patricia said coldly. "Security will escort you out. You'll hear from our lawyers." Alexander looked at Grant, who stood frozen, clearly shocked by how quickly everything had unraveled. Then he looked at the documents on his desk. Evidence of a betrayal so calculated it could only come from someone close. "Who sent you those documents?" Alexander demanded. "They were anonymous, sent from an untraceable email account. Doesn't that strike you as suspicious? Someone frames me and conveniently provides you with evidence?" Patricia's expression didn't soften. "What strikes me as suspicious is that you've been acting erratically for weeks, firing good employees, dealing with public scandals. And now this. Maybe the pressure finally got to you." 2 security guards appeared at the door. Alexander recognized them. Men who'd worked for his company for years, who now wouldn't meet his eyes as they waited to escort him out. "I need time to prove my innocence," Alexander said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "You'll have your chance, through proper legal channels. Until then, you're out." The walk through the office was humiliating. Employees stopped working to watch as Alexander Cole, the man who'd built this company, was escorted out like a common criminal. Some looked sympathetic. Others whispered behind their hands. By the time he reached the parking garage, Alexander's hands were shaking with rage and helplessness. He sat in his car for 20 minutes, unable to drive, unable to think clearly. His phone rang constantly. News outlets, business contacts, people who'd heard rumors and wanted confirmation. He ignored them all except one call. "Dad?" Evan's voice carried concern. "I just saw the news. What happened?" "Someone's destroying me," Alexander said, his voice hollow. "Someone inside my own company. They've stolen millions and made it look like I did it." "Where are you?" "Company parking garage. They just threw me out." "Stay there. I'm coming." 20 minutes later, Evan's Honda pulled up beside Alexander's town car. His son got out and approached, and without a word pulled open Alexander's door. "Come on, you shouldn't be alone right now." They drove to Evan's small apartment across town, a modest 1-bedroom in a neighborhood that had seen better days. It was nothing like the mansion, but it was clean and warm, filled with books and photos of kids from the youth center. Alexander sat on Evan's worn couch, feeling completely out of place. His son moved around the tiny kitchen, making coffee with practiced ease. "When did you learn to make coffee?" Alexander asked, grasping for something normal to say. "When I realized I couldn't afford Starbucks every day on a social worker's salary." Evan brought over 2 mugs and sat across from his father. "Talk to me. What exactly happened?" Alexander explained everything: the missing money, the forged authorization codes, Patricia's ambush, the anonymous documents. As he spoke, he watched Evan's expression shift from shock to anger, to determination. "This is deliberate," Evan said when Alexander finished. "Someone waited until you were already vulnerable from the Robert Fisher scandal, then struck while you were weakened. But who, and why? Who benefits from you being removed from the company?" Alexander considered. Anyone positioned to take over. The board could install a new CEO, or... He stopped, a terrible thought forming. "Grant. He's next in line. If I'm gone, he becomes CEO by default. Your CFO? The one who discovered the fraud? It can't be Grant. He's been loyal for 15 years. Or he's been waiting 15 years for the right moment." The possibility felt like betrayal, layered upon betrayal. Alexander had trusted Grant completely, had relied on him to manage the financial side, while Alexander focused on strategy and growth. "I need proof," Alexander said. "Real proof, not suspicions." "Then we get it." Evan pulled out his laptop. "I may not know business, but I know people, and people always leave traces of their intentions." They worked through the afternoon, Evan surprising Alexander with his methodical approach. While Alexander understood corporate finance, Evan understood human behavior, how people justified their actions, where they'd slip up, what trails they'd leave behind. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Lila sat in the library with her mother, who'd finally been released from the hospital that morning. Ruth looked better but still tired, resting on the leather sofa with blankets tucked around her. "Something bad is happening," Lila said quietly, staring at her journal where she'd written her 3 wishes. "What do you mean, baby?" "Mr. Cole is in trouble, big trouble, I can feel it." Ruth stroked her daughter's braids. "Sometimes we can't fix everything, Lila. Some problems are too big for little girls to solve. But I have one wish left. The important one." "What did you wish for?" Lila closed her journal without answering. "I'll know when it's time to use it." That evening, Evan drove Alexander back to the mansion. As they pulled up the driveway, Alexander noticed how different the house looked with Ruth and Lila living there as family rather than employees. Lights glowed warmly in windows that had been dark for years. It looked like a home instead of a mausoleum. Inside, they found Lila waiting in the foyer, her expression worried. She ran to Alexander immediately. "Are you okay? Mrs. Patterson told us what happened." Alexander knelt down to her level, managing a weak smile. "I've had better days." "But you didn't do it, right? You didn't steal the money?" "No, sweetheart, I didn't." "Then we'll prove it." She said it with such conviction that Alexander almost believed her. Ruth appeared from the kitchen, moving slowly but steadily. "Mr. Cole, Evan, come eat something. You both look terrible." Over dinner, a simple meal of soup and bread that tasted better than anything Alexander had eaten in months, they discussed the situation. Ruth listened with quiet intelligence, occasionally asking questions that cut to the heart of the matter. "Who knew you were already struggling?" she asked. "Who knew the board was already questioning your leadership?" "Everyone in the company," Alexander admitted. "The Robert Fisher incident was public. But who knew exactly how vulnerable you were? Who knew the board's timeline, their specific concerns?" Alexander's eyes widened. "Only people in the boardroom, or someone with access to..." He stopped. "Grant is Patricia Holloway's nephew. I forgot about that connection." "Family," Evan said softly. People do terrible things for family. The irony wasn't lost on anyone at the table. Here sat Alexander, who destroyed his own family relationship through ambition, now being destroyed by someone else's family loyalty. Lila spoke up, her voice small but clear. Maybe this is part of the bridge. What? Alexander looked at her. The bridge I drew. Sometimes you have to fall down before you can climb up. Maybe losing everything is how you find what really matters. Her words settled over the table like a benediction. Alexander reached out and took her small hand in his larger one. When did you get so wise? Mama says I was born old. Lila smiled, despite the worry in her eyes. Mr. Cole, are we still family, even if you lose your company? The question pierced straight through Alexander's remaining defenses. He looked at Ruth, at Lila, at Evan. These three people who'd somehow become the center of his world. Yes, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Company or no company, money or no money, we're still family. Evan's eyes filled with tears. Ruth smiled through her own emotion, and Lila squeezed Alexander's hand tight. Then we'll be okay, she said. Families figure things out together. The next morning brought fresh disaster. News outlets had picked up the story of Alexander's suspension, and speculation ran wild. Billionaire CEO accused of massive fraud, screamed the headlines. Alexander's face appeared on every business channel, his reputation systematically demolished. Alexander sat in his study, watching his world burn on television, when Lila entered carrying her journal. She'd been quiet since breakfast, and now she stood before him with unusual solemnity. I heard you talking with Evan last night, she said, about proving you didn't take the money. You should have been asleep. I was worried. She opened her journal to a page filled with her careful handwriting. You have two choices, right? You can expose Mr. Avery and maybe destroy the whole company, or you can stay quiet and take the blame yourself. Alexander was surprised by her understanding. That's right. If I reveal Grant's theft publicly, the company's reputation will be destroyed. Thousands of people will lose their jobs, but if I don't, I lose everything. What's the right thing to do? I don't know. Anymore, Lila. I used to think I knew the difference between right and wrong, winning and losing. Now everything's blurred. She climbed into the chair beside him, her feet not touching the floor. Mama says, doing what's right isn't the same as winning. Sometimes you have to lose to do the right thing. Your mother is very wise. She is. Lila paused, then added, Mr. Cole, what if there was a third way? What if you could tell the truth and save people's jobs? I don't see how that's possible. Maybe you're not looking at it right. You're thinking like a businessman. What if you thought like Evan thinks? Like someone who helps people instead of just making money? The observation struck deep. Alexander had spent his entire life thinking in terms of profit, loss, and competitive advantage. But Evan had built a life around helping others, and somehow that approach had made him genuinely happy. Something Alexander had never achieved, despite all his wealth. Before Alexander could respond, Evan arrived with news. He'd been working through the night, and his eyes were red from exhaustion, but bright with determination. I think I found something, Evan said, spreading papers across the desk. Grant made a mistake. He got greedy. What kind of mistake? He didn't just steal money. He moved it to accounts connected to shell companies that Patricia Holloway's husband owns. I tracked the corporate registrations. It's buried deep, but it's there. Alexander studied the documents, his mind racing. Patricia's husband died 3 years ago. His estate went into probate. Exactly. And guess who handled the estate liquidation? Grant Avery, as a favor to his aunt. He had access to all those corporate structures, and he repurposed them for the theft. This proves Grant did it, but it also implicates Patricia. If this goes public, the board falls apart. Evan finished. The company faces criminal investigations. Everything collapses. They sat in heavy silence, the weight of the decision pressing down. Alexander could clear his name but destroy everything he'd built, or he could remain silent and lose everything anyway. Lila's voice broke the silence. What about the people who work there? The regular people, not the fancy executives. What about them? Alexander asked. If the company breaks, they lose their jobs. They have families, kids. What happens to them? Evan looked at his father and something passed between them, a shared understanding of what mattered. There might be a way, Evan said slowly. My nonprofit has connections with other organizations, employment networks, job placement services. If we could secure severance packages and transition support before the scandal breaks. That would cost millions, Alexander said. Money I can't access right now. All my assets are frozen pending investigation. But mine aren't. Evan's voice was quiet but firm. I have the Youth Centers Fund. Not much, but it's a start. And I know people, foundations, donors, social service networks. If we frame this as helping displaced workers rather than cleaning up corporate mess, we might get support. Alexander stared at his son in wonder. You'd risk your center's funding for my employees? They're people, Dad. Not just your employees. They're people who need help. That's what I do. The simple generosity of it overwhelmed Alexander. His son, who had every reason to let him fall, was offering to sacrifice his own work to save others. I can't let you do that, Alexander said, his voice rough. You're not letting me. I'm choosing to. Ruth appeared in the doorway, having heard the conversation. There's another option. The trust fund you set up for Lila and me. We could... Absolutely not, Alexander interrupted. That money is yours. For your security. Your future. Our security doesn't mean much if good people lose everything, Ruth said firmly. Use whatever you need. We'll be fine. Alexander looked at these three people, his estranged son, his former employee, and a 10-year-old child, all willing to sacrifice for strangers they'd never met. The contrast with his own cutthroat business world couldn't have been starker. Why? He asked, his voice breaking. Why would you all do this? Lila answered simply. Because it's right, and because you taught us that money should fix what's broken. The decision crystallized. Alexander would expose Grant and Patricia, but he'd do it while ensuring every employee received severance, job placement assistance, and support through the transition. It would cost him everything, but it would be the first truly honorable thing he'd done in years. He called an emergency press conference for the next day, then spent the night coordinating with Evan's network of nonprofits and social services. Word spread quickly through the advocacy community. A billionaire was actually trying to protect workers rather than profits. Support poured in from unexpected places. The morning of the press conference, Alexander stood before the bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie with hands that no longer trembled. He looked different somehow. Older perhaps, but also lighter. The weight of maintaining his empire had been crushing him for so long that letting go felt like liberation. Downstairs, his unlikely family gathered to watch. Ruth sat on the couch with Lila curled against her side. Evan stood behind them, his hand on his father's shoulder, a gesture that would have been impossible just weeks ago. The press conference was broadcast live. Alexander stood at a podium surrounded by cameras and reporters, Grant's evidence displayed on screens behind him. My name is Alexander Cole, he began, his voice steady. And I'm here to tell you the truth. He explained everything. Grant's theft, Patricia's involvement, the forged documents. He showed the evidence Evan had uncovered, the paper trail leading to shell companies and offshore accounts. Cameras flashed as reporters shouted questions. Then Alexander did something unprecedented. He announced that he was liquidating his personal assets to ensure every employee received full severance and job placement assistance through a coalition of nonprofits, led by his son. "I built this company," Alexander said, his voice carrying across the crowded room, "and I'm responsible for what happened within it. Not because I stole, I didn't, but because I created an environment where loyalty and honesty mattered less than profit. That's on me." He paused, looking directly into the cameras. "I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm asking for accountability from Grant Avery, from Patricia Holloway, and most importantly, from myself. The workers at my company deserve better than to be casualties of corporate greed, so I'm making sure they're protected, even if it costs me everything." The room erupted in questions, but Alexander simply said, "That's all," and walked away from the podium. Back at the mansion, the four of them watched the news coverage in silence. Stock prices plummeted. The company's board called emergency meetings. Grant Avery was arrested within hours. Patricia Holloway resigned in disgrace. But among the chaos, something unexpected happened. Public opinion shifted. Alexander Cole, the heartless billionaire, had sacrificed his fortune to protect ordinary workers. Social media erupted with support. Employees who'd feared him now spoke publicly about his final act of integrity. As evening fell, Alexander sat in the library, the same room where this entire journey had begun when Lila first asked him about his books. She entered now, carrying her journal, and sat beside him. "You did it," she said softly. "You chose what was right. I lost everything." "No, you didn't." Lila opened her journal to the page with her 3 wishes. "You found everything. That's different." Alexander pulled her close, this remarkable child who'd seen through him from the beginning. "Thank you, Lila, for your first wish, for everything." "You're welcome." She looked up at him, her eyes wise beyond her years. "But I still have one wish left." "What is it?" She smiled mysteriously. "Not yet. Soon, though. Soon you'll be ready for it." That night, Alexander collapsed from exhaustion and stress. The days of pressure, sleepless nights, and emotional upheaval finally caught up with him. Evan found him unconscious on the study floor and called an ambulance. At the hospital, Lila sat in the waiting room clutching her journal, whispering words no one else could hear. Evan held her hand, his own face drawn with worry. "He'll be okay," Evan said, trying to convince himself as much as Lila. "I know," Lila replied. "He's stronger than he thinks. He just needed to remember that being strong doesn't mean being alone." The heart monitor's steady beep filled Alexander's room. Proof of life, proof of resilience, proof that even in losing everything, he'd somehow gained what mattered most. Ruth joined them in the waiting room, and the 3 of them kept vigil together. A family forged not by blood or employment, but by choice and love and the willingness to sacrifice for each other. Outside the hospital, the world continued its judgment. But inside that room, Alexander Cole, former billionaire, reformed workaholic, and newly redeemed father, fought his way back to consciousness, pulled by the knowledge that people were waiting for him. People who loved him not for his money or power, but for the man he'd finally allowed himself to become. Alexander Cole woke to the sound of steady beeping and the antiseptic smell of hospital air. His vision swam into focus slowly, revealing white ceiling tiles, fluorescent lights, and medical equipment surrounding his bed. For a moment, confusion clouded his thoughts. Then memory returned. The press conference, the collapse, the overwhelming exhaustion that had finally claimed him. He turned his head, and there she was. Lila sat in the chair beside his bed, her journal open on her lap, tears streaming down her face. When she saw his eyes open, she smiled through her crying. "You're awake," she whispered, her voice thick with relief. "How long?" Alexander's throat felt like sandpaper. 2 days. The doctors said you had complete exhaustion, dehydration, and your blood pressure was dangerously high. They said you could have died. The weight of those words settled over him. He'd been so consumed with fighting, with proving his innocence, with doing the right thing, that he'd pushed his body beyond its limits. "Your son is here," Lila continued, "and Mama. They've been taking turns sitting with you. Evan just went to get coffee." As if summoned by her words, Evan appeared in the doorway, coffee cups in hand. When he saw Alexander awake, the cups nearly slipped from his grasp. He set them down quickly and moved to the bedside, his face a mixture of relief and concern. "Dad," he said, and the word carried 12 years of absence and the weight of their fragile reunion. "You scared us." "I scared myself," Alexander admitted, his voice rough. He tried to sit up, but Evan gently pressed him back down. "Don't. The doctor said you need to rest. Really rest this time." "What happened?" After the press conference, Evan pulled up another chair, sitting close. "The world happened. Grant's been charged with embezzlement and fraud. Patricia resigned and is facing her own investigation. Your company is in chaos, but the Employee Protection Fund worked. Everyone's getting severance and job placement help. The media's calling you everything from a hero to a cautionary tale. And the truth? The truth is you did something remarkable. You chose people over profit. That matters more than you know." Alexander closed his eyes, processing everything. His empire was gone, his fortune depleted, his reputation forever changed. Yet somehow, lying in this hospital bed with his son beside him and Lila holding his hand, he felt more at peace than he had in decades. "I need to tell you something," Alexander said, looking at Evan. "Something I should have said 12 years ago." Evan's expression grew cautious, guarded. "I was wrong," Alexander continued, his voice strengthening despite his physical weakness. "About everything. About what success means, about what matters in life, about you. You chose compassion over ambition, and I called it weakness. But you were right, and I was wrong. You're doing more good in that youth center than I ever did in my company." Evan's eyes filled with tears. "Dad, I'm not finished." Alexander reached out, and Evan took his hand. "I'm proud of you. Proud of the man you became, despite my efforts to make you into something else. Proud of how you help people, how you see the world, how you never lost your humanity even when I tried to teach you that humanity was a liability." The dam broke. Evan leaned forward, his forehead touching his father's hand, and wept. Years of hurt, anger, and unspoken longing poured out in that moment. Alexander placed his other hand on his son's head, his own tears flowing freely. "I'm sorry," Alexander whispered, "for everything, for every harsh word, every impossible expectation, every moment I chose work over you. I'm so sorry." "I forgive you," Evan said through his tears. "I've been wanting to forgive you for so long, but I didn't know how. And then Lila showed me that it wasn't about knowing how. It was just about doing it." They stayed like that for a long moment, father and son, bridging a 12-year chasm with simple words and honest emotion. When they finally separated, both men were smiling despite their tears. Lila had been watching quietly, and now she spoke. "The first wish is complete." Alexander turned to her, this extraordinary child who'd orchestrated everything. "You're right. I've forgiven myself, and Evan's forgiven me. Your first wish came true. All 3 wishes came true," Lila said softly. She held up her journal, showing him the page. "Wish 1, forgive your son. Wish 2, let Mama rest. Wish 3, she paused, her voice becoming smaller. "Wish 3 is the hardest one. What is it?" Alexander asked, suddenly concerned by her expression. Lila looked at her mother, who had just entered the room. Ruth moved to her daughter's side, placing a hand on her shoulder. There was something in their faces, a shared knowledge, a prepared conversation. "Baby, you don't have to," Ruth began, but Lila shook her head. "Yes, I do. It's time." She turned back to Alexander, and her eyes held a depth of emotion that seemed impossible for someone so young. "Mr. Cole, my third wish is for you to have a family again. A real family." Alexander smiled gently. "Sweetheart, I do have a family. I have Evan, I have you, and your mother." "No," Lila interrupted, her voice trembling. "I mean a real family. Legal family. Forever family." She took a deep breath, and the words came out in a rush. "I want you to adopt me. I want to be your granddaughter for real, not just because we live in the same house. I want it to be true and legal, and forever." The room fell silent. Alexander stared at her, his mind struggling to process what she'd just said. Ruth's hand covered her mouth, tears already flowing. Evan looked stunned. "Lila," Alexander finally managed, his voice breaking. That's an enormous wish." "I know, but it's what I want. You lost a family, and I lost a daddy. Maybe we can fix both things together." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Maybe we can be each other's second chance." Alexander felt his chest tighten, emotions overwhelming him. He looked at Ruth, searching for confirmation that this was real, that he'd heard correctly. Ruth nodded, tears streaming down her face. "She's been talking about it for weeks. Ever since you set up the trust fund, she said you needed someone to love you the way a grandchild loves a grandfather, not because of money or obligation, but because of choice." "But Ruth," Alexander said, "this isn't just about Lila and me. This is about you, about your daughter. I can't just—" "I know exactly what this is about," Ruth said firmly. "And if you're asking for my blessing, you have it. You saved my life, Mr. Cole. You gave us security and safety and a home. More than that, you've shown Lila what it means to grow and change and become better. You're not the same man who hired me 6 years ago. You're not even the same man who carried me to the hospital 3 weeks ago. You've become someone worthy of being her grandfather." Alexander turned back to Lila, who watched him with hope and fear warring in her expression. "Sweetheart, that's the one thing money could never buy. But I'd give everything I have left, everything I am, to earn it." "You already have," Lila said simply. She climbed carefully onto the hospital bed, mindful of the IV lines, and curled against his side. "You earned it when you chose to be kind, when you let Evan back in, when you saved all those people's jobs even though it cost you everything. That's when you became the kind of grandfather I'd want." Alexander wrapped his arms around her. This child who'd seen through his defenses from the very beginning, who'd used her 3 wishes not for toys or trips, but to heal broken hearts and rebuild broken families. "Then yes," he whispered into her braids. "Yes, Lila, I would be honored, more honored than anything else in my life, to be your grandfather." Lila hugged him tighter, and Alexander felt something he hadn't experienced in over a decade. Pure, uncomplicated joy. Evan moved closer, placing his hand on Lila's back, completing the circle. Ruth joined them, her hand on Alexander's shoulder. In that hospital room surrounded by beeping machines and sterile walls, a family was truly born. Not through blood or obligation, but through choice and love and the courage to forgive. "There's paperwork," Alexander said, practically, even as emotions overwhelmed him. "Legal processes. It could take months." "That's okay," Lila said. "The wish is already real in our hearts. The papers are just to make it official for everyone else." A knock at the door interrupted the moment. A doctor entered, followed by a nurse. The physician looked surprised to see so many people crowded around the bed. "Mr. Cole, you're awake. How are you feeling?" "Like I just got the greatest gift of my life." Alexander said, unable to stop smiling. The doctor checked his vitals, asked questions about pain and symptoms, and reviewed the monitor readings. Finally, he nodded with satisfaction. Your numbers are improving. Whatever conversation you just had at it was apparently good medicine. But you're staying here at least another 2 days. Your body needs rest, Mr. Cole. Real rest. I can do that, Alexander agreed. I have nowhere else to be. Actually, Evan said quietly, you have everywhere to be. But this time, you'll be there for the right reasons. After the doctor left, they talked for hours about logistics, about the future, about the foundation Alexander wanted to create once the adoption was finalized. Lila described her vision for it, a place that helped children without families find homes with people who needed love as much as the children did. Not an orphanage, she explained. More like a bridge, connecting lonely grown-ups with kids who need them, because sometimes grown-ups are orphans too, in their hearts. The Cole Foundation for Children and Families, Alexander suggested. No, the Williams Cole Foundation. You and your mother should be part of the name. Ruth started to protest, but Alexander shook his head. You're family now. Really, truly family. The name should reflect that. As evening approached, exhaustion began pulling Alexander back toward sleep. The emotional weight of the day, combined with his body's need to heal, made his eyelids heavy. Rest, Dad, Evan said gently. We'll be here when you wake up. Promise? The word came out vulnerable, almost childlike. I promise. We're not going anywhere. Alexander drifted off with Lila still curled against his side, her small hand holding his larger one. For the first time in decades, his sleep was peaceful and dreamless. The sleep of a man who'd finally found what he'd been searching for all along. 3 months later, the mansion that had once felt like a mausoleum had transformed into something Alexander hardly recognized. A home. The grand hallways that once echoed with silence now rang with laughter. The library where Lila had first asked him uncomfortable questions was now filled with children every Saturday afternoon. Alexander stood at the window of his study, watching as a group of kids from local foster programs played in the garden. Evan was out there with them, organizing some kind of game that involved a lot of running and shouting. Lila directed the chaos with the confidence of a seasoned conductor, her braids flying as she dashed between groups. They're going to destroy your rose garden, Ruth said, entering with a tray of lemonade. Good, Alexander replied, smiling. It was too pristine anyway. Gardens should be lived in, not just looked at. Ruth set down the tray and joined him at the window. In the months since the hospital, their relationship had shifted into something comfortable and familial. She was no longer an employee, but a co-architect of the new life they were building. The adoption papers are finalized, she said softly. The lawyer called this morning. It's official. Lila is legally your granddaughter. Alexander's vision blurred with tears. I never thought I'd cry this much. I spent 63 years refusing to cry, and now I can't seem to stop. That's called being alive, Mr. Cole. Alexander, he corrected gently. Please, Ruth. We're family. Call me Alexander. She smiled. Old habits. But I'll work on it. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the children play. The Williams Cole Foundation had launched 2 months earlier, and already they'd facilitated 6 adoptions, matching children in need with adults who'd lost their way but found purpose in loving again. A knock at the study door announced a visitor. Patricia Holloway stood there, looking diminished in a way that had nothing to do with her physical appearance. The board member who'd once commanded rooms with her presence now seemed uncertain, almost fragile. Mr. Cole, she said quietly, thank you for agreeing to see me. Alexander had debated this meeting. Patricia had resigned in disgrace, had been complicit in Grant's theft, had tried to destroy him. But Lila's words echoed in his mind. Forgiveness isn't about them deserving it. It's about you choosing peace. "Come in," he said. Patricia entered, clutching her purse like a lifeline. Ruth excused herself tactfully, leaving them alone. Alexander gestured to a chair and they sat across from each other, former adversaries searching for new ground. "I don't expect forgiveness," Patricia began. "I just wanted to explain. Grant is my sister's son. When she died, I promised to look after him. When he came to me with this plan, I thought—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "I thought family loyalty meant protecting him, even when he was wrong. Family loyalty without integrity is just enabling," Alexander said, but his voice lacked its former harshness. "I learned that the hard way with my own son. I heard you reconciled. I'm glad." Patricia's hands twisted in her lap. "I'm facing charges. My lawyers say I'll likely serve time. But before that happens, I wanted you to know I'm sorry for everything." Alexander studied her, this woman who'd tried to destroy him, and found he couldn't hold on to his anger. Too much had changed. He'd lost everything and gained what mattered. Holding grudges felt like carrying stones when he needed his hands free to embrace his family. "I accept your apology," he said simply. "What you did was wrong, but I understand why you did it. We all make mistakes for people we love." Patricia's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. That's more grace than I deserve." "Probably. But it turns out grace isn't about deserving. That's what makes it grace." After Patricia left, Alexander returned to the window. The children had moved their game closer to the house, and he could hear Lila's voice clearly now, directing someone to "run faster or the lava will get you." He chuckled at her imagination. Evan appeared at the study door, grass-stained and grinning. "Dad, Lila says you promised to teach chess to anyone interested. We have 3 takers. You up for it?" "Absolutely." Alexander stood, feeling the lingering effects of his hospitalization, but managing well. The doctors had been clear. Reduce stress, exercise regularly, eat better, and most importantly, find reasons to live rather than just work. He'd followed every instruction with unusual compliance. In the library, 3 children sat waiting. 2 boys and a girl, ages ranging from 8 to 12. They eyed Alexander with a mixture of curiosity and nervousness. To them, he was still a billionaire, even if a fallen one. Someone from a world they didn't understand. "Who knows how chess pieces move?" Alexander asked, setting up the board. Silence. Then the youngest boy raised his hand tentatively. "The horse goes in an L?" "The knight, yes." "Very good." Alexander smiled. "Chess is a game about strategy, but it's also a game about sacrifice. Sometimes you have to lose pieces to win the game. Sometimes the smallest piece, the pawn, becomes the most powerful." He spent the next 2 hours teaching them, surprised by how much he enjoyed it. These children listened with an intensity his board members never had. They asked questions without fear, laughed when they made mistakes, and celebrated small victories with genuine joy. Leela watched from the doorway, her journal tucked under her arm. When the lesson ended and the children ran off to find snacks, she approached Alexander. "You're good at that," she observed. "Teaching? Being a grandpa." The words warmed him more than any business deal ever had. "I'm still learning, but I have an excellent teacher." He tapped her journal. "Still writing wishes? Different ones now. Not fixing wishes, growing wishes." She opened the journal, showing him pages filled with sketches and words. Like wishes for the foundation, wishes for kids to find homes, wishes for sad people to remember how to smile. Those are beautiful wishes. I learned from the best. She hugged him suddenly, fiercely. "Thank you for letting me be your granddaughter." "Thank you for choosing me," Alexander replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm the lucky one." That evening, the mansion hosted a small gathering, the first social event Alexander had thrown in years. But unlike his previous corporate functions, this was intimate and warm. Evans, colleagues from the youth center mixed with foundation volunteers. Ruth's friends from her church group chatted with former employees who'd found new jobs through the placement program. Someone had set up music in the garden, and as twilight fell, people danced and laughed under strings of lights. Alexander found himself standing on the terrace, watching it all with wonder. A year ago, this house had been silent and cold. Now it pulsed with life. Leela appeared beside him, holding something behind her back. "I made you something," she said. She revealed a new drawing, more sophisticated than her earlier attempts. It showed 3 figures standing on a completed bridge, golden sunlight breaking through clouds above them. But this time, there were more figures in the background. Children, adults, all crossing the bridge together. The first one showed the bridge broken, Lila explained. Then I drew it being built. Now it's finished. And look, it's not just for us. It's for everyone who needs to cross from lonely to loved. Alexander took the drawing with shaking hands. "It's perfect. I want you to put it in the foundation office, so everyone who comes there sees it and knows that bridges can be built, even after they've been burned. We'll frame it tomorrow," Alexander promised, "right in the entrance where it'll be the first thing people see." Evan joined them on the terrace, carrying champagne for himself and Alexander, juice for Lila. "A toast," he said, "to new beginnings." "To bridges," Lila added. "To family," Ruth contributed, appearing with her own glass. They clinked glasses as the party continued below. Alexander looked at each of them, his son, his granddaughter, and Ruth, who'd become a daughter in all but name. His empire was gone, his fortune depleted, his reputation forever changed. Yet standing here, surrounded by love and purpose, he'd never felt richer. "You know what's funny?" Alexander said thoughtfully. "I spent my whole life building an empire, and I thought that was my legacy. But this..." He gestured to the gathering, to the people laughing and connecting. "This is the legacy I'll actually leave behind. Not buildings or businesses, but bridges, connections, hope. The richest gift is the one that costs nothing," Lila quoted softly. "Where did you hear that?" "You said it. In the hospital when you were sleeping. You kept whispering it like you were trying to remember something important." Alexander hadn't realized he'd spoken aloud, but the words felt true. Everything he'd lost, money, power, prestige, had cost him nothing to lose because they'd never truly been his. They were temporary, transactional, conditional. But this family, this purpose, this love, cost nothing and meant everything. As the party wound down and guests began leaving, Alexander stood at the front door, saying goodbye to each person individually. Some thanked him for the foundation. Others shared stories of how the employee placement program had helped them. Many simply expressed gratitude for his presence in their lives. When the last guest left, Alexander returned to find Lila curled up on the library couch, nearly asleep. He carried her upstairs, something that would have been unthinkable months ago, and tucked her into bed. "Grandpa?" she murmured, half asleep. "Yes, sweetheart. Did all 3 wishes come true?" "Every single one." "Good. That means the magic worked." Her eyes fluttered closed. "Love is the best magic there is." Alexander kissed her forehead and turned off the light, leaving the door cracked open. In the hallway, he found Evan waiting. "She asleep?" his son asked. "Finally. That child has more energy than the entire stock market." They walked downstairs together, and Alexander noticed how natural it felt. This casual companionship with his son. No tension, no unspoken resentments, just comfortable presence. "I've been thinking," Evan said as they reached the study. The foundation needs a full-time director, someone who understands both the business side and the human side, someone who can bridge those worlds. You're suggesting yourself? I'm suggesting us, together. You handle the operations and logistics. You're brilliant at that. I handle the social work and programming. We co-direct. The proposal stunned Alexander. You'd give up the youth center? Not give up. Expand. The foundation can absorb the youth center, become something bigger. We could help more people, reach more families, build more bridges. Evan paused. Plus, I'd get to work with my dad every day. That's worth more than independence. Alexander felt tears threatening again. I'd like that. I'd like that very much. They shook hands, then embraced, a real embrace, the kind that carried years of reconciliation and hope for years ahead. Later that night, alone in his study, Alexander pulled out Lila's new drawing and pinned it beside the old one. The progression was clear. Broken bridge, bridge being built, bridge completed and crowded with people crossing toward hope. He opened his journal, a new habit Lila had inspired, and wrote, "Today I became officially what I've felt for months, Lila's grandfather. The adoption is complete. But more than that, I'm complete. I spent 63 years building walls and calling it success. Now I'm building bridges and calling it life. Everything I lost brought me to everything I found. The richest gift truly is the one that costs nothing. The gift of being chosen, being loved, being given a second chance at family." He closed the journal and looked around his study. The room that had once felt like a prison now felt like a sanctuary. Outside, the city lights twinkled. Inside, his family slept peacefully under the same roof. Alexander Cole had started this journey as a billionaire with an empire and an empty heart. He was ending it with nearly nothing in the bank and everything that mattered in his life, and he would make that trade every single day for the rest of his life. The bridge was complete. The wishes were fulfilled. The family was whole. And in a mansion that had finally become a home, love, the kind that costs nothing and means everything, reigned supreme. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that remind us what wealth really means.